The morning Daniel Hurst got fired, he was carrying a cup of coffee he never got to drink. It was a Tuesday in early March, the kind of cold that settles into your coat no matter how thick it is. And he had woken up at 5:30 the way he always did. Not from an alarm, but from the sound of his daughter moving around in her room down the hall. Mia was 8 years old and had never once slept past 6. She was his alarm clock, his reason to get up, his reason for most things, really, though he hadn't always understood that until her mother left. He had made her oatmeal with brown sugar the way she liked it, packed her lunch, walked her to the bus stop in the dark, and kissed the top of her head before she climbed the steps. She turned at the top and gave him the little wave she always gave him, elbow bent, fingers together, more of a salute than a wave. And he stood there until the bus turned the corner and disappeared. Then he drove 40 minutes south to the Meridian Tower in downtown Calgary, took the elevator to the 14th floor, set his coffee on his desk, and by 9:15 he no longer had a job. The woman who fired him was named Petra Voss. She had been appointed Regional Operations Director 8 months earlier, brought in from a consulting firm in Toronto that specialized in what she called organizational restructuring, which, Daniel had come to understand, meant firing the people who had been there longest and replacing them with systems that cost less and broke more often. Petra was 41, spoke in bullet points, and had never once set foot in the actual facilities she was responsible for overseeing. She managed from spreadsheets. She trusted metrics the way other people trusted friends. Daniel had been with Meridian Safety Systems for 11 years. He had started as a field technician, spent 3 years crawling through utility corridors and service shafts in buildings across Alberta, learning every flaw and failure point in automated emergency systems the way a doctor learns anatomy, by seeing what goes wrong. He moved into system architecture year 4, became senior engineer at year 7, and for the past 2 years had been the lead designer on Meridian's proprietary integrated lockdown protocol, a fail-safe framework that managed emergency access control across 14 commercial high-rises in the province. His name was on the patent. Petra Voss did not know this. What she knew was that Daniel's salary sat at the top of her department's expense column, that he had declined to attend her last 3 alignment workshops, and that when she had presented her Q4 restructuring plan to the executive team, Daniel had raised his hand and pointed out, with quiet specificity, that her proposed timeline would leave 3 buildings without compliant fire egress protocols for a period of 6 weeks. She had thanked him for his input and moved on. He had followed up in writing. She had not responded. The meeting where she fired him lasted less than 10 minutes. She sat across from him in a small glass-walled room off the main floor and told him that the company was evolving its talent strategy, that his role was being consolidated into existing team functions, and that HR had prepared a package that reflected his years of service. She slid a folder across the table. She did not make eye contact while she did it. Daniel looked at the folder. He looked at Petra. He thought about Mia's oatmeal, still warm on the counter when he left. He thought about the 11 years of early mornings and late-night debugging sessions, and the winter he spent in Red Deer reworking a defective pressure latch system in a building where the previous engineer had cut corners in a way that could have killed someone. He thought about all of it, and then he said nothing because there was nothing useful to say. He picked up the folder. He stood. Petra was already looking at her phone. "You can take the rest of the day to collect your things," she said without looking up. "Your access card will be deactivated at end of business." He was almost to the door when she added, almost as an afterthought, "I appreciate your contributions, Daniel. I'm sure you'll land on your feet." He did not respond to that either. He took his coffee, which had gone cold, and his daughter's school photo from his desk, and the small wooden-handled multi-tool that had belonged to his father, and he put them in a canvas bag and walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby and stood very still while the floors counted down. In the parking garage, he sat in his truck for a long time without starting it. He was 43 years old. He had a daughter, a mortgage, and 14 months left on his truck payments. He had no wife, no second income, and a severance package that would last, if he was careful, about 4 months. He had a set of skills so specific that most people in his industry didn't fully understand what he did, which made him hard to replace, but also, he had just learned, easy to dismiss. He sat there until the cold got into the cab, and then he started the truck, and he drove to pick up Mia from school 4 hours early. And when she saw him standing in the office doorway, she looked confused and then concerned, and then she came to him and pressed her face against his jacket. "What happened?" she asked. "I've got some time off," he said. "I thought we could go get pancakes." She accepted this. She was 8. She was practical. They got pancakes. The weeks after that were quieter than Daniel had expected. He applied for positions, updated his credentials, made coffee at home instead of buying it, and spent the hours between school drop-off and pickup working through the problem of what came next. He kept the structure of his days intact. Up early, Mia's lunch packed, bus stop at 6:50, because structure was the thing that held him together, and he knew it. He did not tell many people what had happened. His sister Gwen knew, and his neighbor Frank, who was 70 and retired and sometimes watched Mia if Daniel had an evening call. That was about it. He was not a person who broadcast his difficulties. He did not hear anything from Meridian. Then, on a Thursday morning 42 days after his termination, his phone rang at 7:18. He was on his second cup of coffee, reviewing an application for a firm in Edmonton, when he saw the number, a Meridian main line. He let it ring through. A voicemail appeared. He listened to it standing at his kitchen counter. It was Petra Voss. Her voice had lost its bullet point quality. She sounded careful, tight. "Daniel, this is Petra. I'm reaching out because there's a situation at Northgate Center with the integrated lockdown system. Our internal team has been working on it since last night, and we haven't been able to. We need someone with detailed knowledge of the original architecture. I was hoping you might be available to consult. Please call me back as soon as you can." He set his phone down on the counter. He poured the rest of his coffee down the sink, rinsed the mug, and drove Mia to school. He did not call back. By noon, the number had called 4 more times. Twice from Petra. Once from a number he didn't recognize. Once from Gerald Fitch, the company's vice president of operations, who had been at Meridian for 20 years and had shaken Daniel's hand the day he was hired and not spoken to him since the restructuring began. Daniel was at the grocery store when Gerald's voicemail came in. He listened to it in the cereal aisle. Gerald's voice was low and measured, but underneath it there was something Daniel had never heard from him before, urgency that had curdled into something close to fear. "Daniel, Jerry Fitch here. I know the circumstances of your departure weren't ideal, and I want to address that directly at some point. But right now I need you to understand that we have a serious operational problem. Northgate Center's integrated lockdown activated at approximately 11 p.m. last night during a routine firmware update. We don't know why. 14 of the building's emergency access doors are locked and are not responding to override commands. The system isn't accepting any of our inputs. We have a night custodian who's been in a sealed maintenance corridor since 11:30 last night. He's okay. He has water. He has his phone, but we cannot get to him. Fire has been on site since 5 this morning. We've been through every fail-safe protocol we have on file, and nothing is working. Daniel, you built this system. We need you. Please call me back." Daniel stood in the cereal aisle for a moment. He thought about the maintenance corridor on the east side of Northgate, a long, low passage that ran between the electrical room and the HVAC's junction. He had been in that corridor. He knew what it smelled like. The particular quality of the air, the sound the ventilation made when it cycled. He had designed the locking mechanism on the door at its north end himself, including the manual bypass that required a specific command sequence that existed in exactly one document. His original architecture notes, which he had submitted to Meridian's engineering archive on the day he completed the project. He thought about whoever was in that corridor. He didn't know the man's name. He thought about someone sitting on a concrete floor in the dark, listening to the ventilation cycle, not knowing if anyone was coming. He put a box of Mia's cereal in his cart and kept shopping. He drove home. He put the groceries away. He sat down at his kitchen table. Then he called Gerald Fitch back. Gerald picked up on the first ring. "Daniel, thank God." "Tell me the current state of the system," Daniel said. "Not hello, not how are you, just the work," Gerald told him. The firmware update had been pushed by Petra's team as part of the restructuring's cost reduction phase. They had switched to a third-party maintenance vendor who had applied a patch that conflicted with a proprietary sequence in Daniel's original code. The system had interpreted the conflict as a breach attempt and had gone into full defensive lockdown. It was functioning exactly as designed. It was protecting the building against what it believed was an intrusion. The problem was that no one on the current team understood the system well enough to tell it otherwise. The manual bypass codes, Daniel said. We can't locate the documentation. I know. Because it's in the engineering archive under a filing system your restructuring team eliminated in November. He had known this was coming, or something like it, in the way you sometimes know a storm is coming from the quality of the light. I have copies. Gerald exhaled. It was the exhale of a man who has been holding his breath for 8 hours. Daniel, I need to ask you. I'll tell you what I need first, Daniel said. He had not planned this, not exactly. But the words came out clear and without heat, the way he spoke when he was certain of something. I'll come in. I'll fix the system. I'll get your custodian out. And then you and I are going to have a different conversation than the one Petra Voss had with me 6 weeks ago. A pause. Yes, Gerald said. Absolutely, whatever you need. I also need to know Petra Voss is not in the building when I arrive. Another pause, shorter. That can be arranged. Daniel picked up Mia from school first. He called his neighbor Frank, who said of course and came over in 10 minutes with a deck of cards and a look that said he understood more than he was being told. Mia kissed Daniel on the cheek and told him to drive safe and went to sit with Frank at the kitchen table. Daniel changed into his work clothes, the ones he'd stopped wearing 6 weeks ago, and drove to Northgate Center. There were 2 fire trucks outside and a cluster of people near the main entrance, some in uniforms and some in suits. All of them looking at the building with a particular expression of people confronting a problem they cannot solve. A man Daniel didn't recognize came toward him as he crossed the parking lot, 30s, jacket too thin for the weather, tablet in his hand. The replacement, probably. Or one of them. You're Daniel Hurst? The man said. Yes. I'm Kevin from the new operations team. I've been trying to. I need building access and a direct line to whoever's coordinating with the fire crew, Daniel said. He was not unkind. He was just moving. Inside, he took 11 minutes. He found the system terminal on the 2nd floor, connected his laptop and navigated through the locked architecture to the proprietary command layer. He entered the bypass sequence from memory. 18 characters, a combination of digits and letters that corresponded to a logic pattern only he knew, and watched the status indicators on the screen shift from red to amber to green, one sector at a time. The door to the maintenance corridor unlocked at 3047 p.m. The custodian's name was Hector Villanueva. He was 61 years old, had worked at Northgate for 9 years, and had spent 16 hours and 22 minutes in a sealed corridor on a concrete floor. When the door opened, he was sitting against the wall with his back straight and his hands on his knees, and he looked at Daniel the way a man looks at someone who has just done him a considerable favor. You good? Daniel said. Hector considered this. Cold, he said. Hungry. Need to call my wife. There's paramedics outside. I know. He stood slowly. You the one who fixed it? Yes. Hector nodded. He looked at Daniel for a moment with the frank assessment of someone who has had a long time to think. Good, he said. Then he walked toward the light. Gerald Fitch was waiting in the building manager's office on the 3rd floor. He looked older than Daniel remembered. The restructuring had aged him. Or maybe it was the last 16 hours. Sit down, Gerald said. Daniel sat. I owe you an apology, Gerald said. Not just for today, for the whole situation. I should have been more involved in Petra's decisions. I knew your role was being eliminated and I didn't push back the way I should have. Daniel listened. He did not rush to reassure him. I want to offer you your position back, full reinstatement, retroactive pay for the 6 weeks. And I want to talk about what the title and the scope look like going forward, because frankly, what happened today makes it very clear that we don't actually have anyone who understands what you built. Gerald folded his hands on the desk. I also want you to know that Petra Voss is no longer with the company. As of this afternoon. Daniel looked at him. Did she resign? She was asked to. Gerald met his eyes. What happened today? The firmware patch her team authorized without any review by someone who understood the system architecture. That's a serious liability issue. We have a man who spent 16 hours in a sealed corridor. We had fire crews on site for 9 hours. The regulatory review is going to be significant. He paused. She made a number of decisions in this company that were not as well considered as they appeared on a spreadsheet. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I'll come back, he said. But I want the system documentation properly archived and access protected. I want any future modifications to require sign-off from the lead architect. Whoever holds that role. And I wanted in writing that this kind of restructuring, eliminating institutional knowledge to cut salary costs, gets an engineering review before it happens. Gerald nodded. He did not look like a man who was going to argue. One more thing, Daniel said. Hector Villanueva, the custodian. Whatever the company does in terms of acknowledging what he went through, I'd like to know it's handled properly. Gerald looked at him for a moment, and something in his expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but recalibration. A reevaluation of who he was dealing with. That's already being arranged, he said quietly. Daniel drove home in the dark. The temperature had dropped and the city lights were doing what they always did on cold, clear nights. Burning sharper, like something had been cleaned off the sky. He thought about Hector sitting on that corridor floor, back straight, hands on his knees. That was a certain kind of person, the kind who endures without collapsing. He pulled into the driveway and sat for a minute. Through the front window, he could see the light in the kitchen, warm and yellow. He could see the shape of Frank at the table and, across from him, Mia, her elbows on the table, her chin in her hands, looking at the cards in front of her with the deep concentration she brought to everything. She had his eyes. Everybody said so, dark and level and a little serious. He got out of the truck. She heard the door and appeared in the front hallway before he even had his boots off, still in her socks, and looked at him the way she always looked at him when he came home later than expected, not with worry exactly, more with the careful assessment of someone taking inventory. Frank taught me gin rummy, she said. Is that right? I beat him twice. Frank let you win. Frank says he didn't. She studied him. Did you fix it? He hung up his jacket. He thought about what to say and then said the simple thing, because she was 8 and practical, and it never once needed him to make things more complicated than they were. Yeah, he said. I fixed it. She nodded. That was enough. She turned and went back to the kitchen to finish the hand, and he followed her. And Frank looked up at him over his cards with a look that asked everything at once, and Daniel gave him the smallest nod. And Frank smiled and looked back at his cards. Gin, said Mia. Frank put his hand down and shook his head. This kid, he said to no one in particular. Daniel sat down at the table. The kitchen was warm. The cards were spread out on the wood. His daughter was watching him with her level, serious eyes, waiting for him to deal the next hand. He picked up the deck. He shuffled. He dealt. I keep thinking about that cereal aisle. Daniel Hurst standing there, a box of his daughter's cereal in his hand, listening to a voicemail from the man whose company had discarded him 6 weeks earlier, and making the choice, quietly, without drama, to finish his shopping first. That image stays with me, because it tells you everything about who he was and why things ended the way they did. There's something I've come to believe, and it's not complicated. How a person carries themselves when no one is watching is the thing that determines what happens when everyone is. Daniel didn't storm back. He didn't make calls he'd regret. He put his groceries away, drove his daughter to school, and only then picked up the phone. That's not weakness. That's a kind of integrity that most people talk about, and very few actually practice. The kind that holds even when it costs you something. And it did cost him. 6 weeks of uncertainty, a mortgage ticking in the background, a daughter who accepted some time off with the grace of a kid who trusts her father completely. That trust wasn't free. He had earned it, the same way he had earned everything else in his life, by showing up, doing the work, and not cutting corners even when no one would have noticed if he had. What Petra Voss missed, what people like her always miss, is that competence isn't decorative. It doesn't live on a resume. It lives in the thing Daniel Hurst carried in his head for 11 years. 18 characters in a specific sequence that no spreadsheet could replicate. You can restructure a department. You can eliminate a salary line. You cannot reorganize your way out of not knowing what you're doing. The knowledge was real. The dismissal was not. I think about Hector Villanueva too. 61 years old, sitting on a concrete floor in the dark for 16 hours, back straight, hands on his knees. Nobody had designed that situation. It arrived because someone in a meeting room made a decision without fully understanding the consequences. The way so many costly decisions get made. And Daniel's first ask, before the title, before the paperwork, was that Hector be treated properly. That detail matters to me more than almost anything else in the story. Because intelligence without conscience is just cleverness. And cleverness on its own is fragile. What actually holds, over time and through difficulty, is the combination, the skill to solve the problem, the persistence to have stayed sharp through 11 years of unglamorous work, and the decency to think about the custodian on the floor before thinking about your own contract. I don't think Daniel Hurst set out to prove anything. I think he just kept going, fed his daughter oatmeal, showed up, knew his work well enough to carry it with him when they took everything else away. That's not a story about revenge. That's a story about what you're left with when the title is gone. Turns out it was enough.